In the early 1950s, inside a sleep laboratory in Chicago, a young researcher watched the eyes of a sleeping child begin to move rapidly beneath closed lids. The room itself would not have seemed remarkable to an outsider. There were electrodes, recording equipment, paper tracings, the quiet patience of observation. But what Eugene Aserinsky and his colleagues were seeing hinted at something deeply strange: sleep, which had so often appeared from the outside as stillness and silence, was revealing an inner drama beneath the calm surface of the sleeping body. The brain was not simply shutting down, it was changing state, shifting rhythm, perhaps even entering a condition in which the mind could continue to build images, emotions, and entire worlds. If you place yourself in that room for a moment, the mystery becomes almost immediate. A person lies motionless, cut off from the ordinary demands of the day, and yet somewhere behind the closed eyes, a hidden experience is unfolding. A face might appear, a memory might distort itself into a scene, a fear might return wearing the mask of a story. For centuries, dreams had been treated as prophecy, symbolism, private theater, or psychological confession. But now a different kind of question was taking shape. Not what dreams meant alone, but what the brain was doing to produce them. That question would lead scientists, psychologists, neurologists, and theorists into one of the most elusive territories in the study of the mind. Some believe dreams revealed buried wishes and emotional truths. Others argued that dreaming began as bursts of internal brain activity, with the sleeping mind struggling to assemble them into something coherent. Later still, researchers would ask whether dreams help process memory, regulate emotion, simulate danger, or simply accompany consciousness as it flickers through the architecture of sleep. And at nearly every stage, just when the mystery seemed close to resolution, it opened again. Tonight, we step into that mystery. We follow the dreaming brain from the first fading of the waking world into the strange territories of REM sleep, memory, emotion, and selfhood. What exactly happens in the brain when we dream, and why has that answer remained so difficult to pin down? When the world grows quiet and the body falls still, what kind of mind remains awake inside the night? At first, almost nothing seems to happen. The room is still the room. A faint sound continues somewhere beyond the walls. The last practical thoughts of the day drift through the mind in loose, unfinished form. And yet, if you pay attention to this boundary closely, you can feel the beginning of a change that is more profound than it appears. Attention no longer holds the world with the same firmness. Thoughts stop moving in orderly lines and begin instead to soften at the edges. One image lingers longer than it should. A memory rises without being summoned. A place from years ago leans quietly against something that happened that morning. The mind has not gone dark. It has begun to loosen. What we call falling asleep is not a switch being flipped, but a passage, delicate and gradual, in which the ordinary structure of waking consciousness begins to give way. It is in this first drift that the mystery of dreaming truly begins. Before the dream becomes dramatic, before landscapes open or faces emerge or impossible events unfold with perfect conviction, there is this quieter transformation. The world outside grows less commanding. The world inside grows less supervised. The sounds in the room are still present, but they begin to lose their authority. Your own thoughts no longer answer to the same rules. A phrase may detach itself from its original meaning. A brief concern from the day may change shape and become an image. A person may appear in the mind, not because you are trying to remember them, but because the mind, as it slips towards sleep, has begun to move by association rather than intention. Something is changing in the brain long before the first full dream is remembered. The descent into sleep is already a descent into another way of organizing experience. This transition is so familiar that it is easy to overlook how strange it really is. In waking life, consciousness usually feels anchored. It is tied to the room, to the clock, to the body, to the steady correction of the senses. A chair remains a chair. A voice comes from a person in front of you. Time passes in one direction, and the world resists imagination with the firmness of physical fact. But on the threshold of sleep, that arrangement begins to weaken. Thought detaches from immediate reality. Images emerge without permission. Logic no longer stands guard with the same vigilance. The mind starts to construct experience with less input from the world outside and more from the vast interior archive of memory, emotion, expectation, and association. What is remarkable is not simply that dreams occur, it is that the brain can move into a state where it begins to generate a world and then inhabit it as though it were real. If you have ever noticed yourself thinking in those final moments before sleep, you may have felt how subtle the crossing is. There is often no single instant when one can say, here waking ended and dreaming began. Instead, there is a kind of soft misalignment. The thought you were following becomes a scene. The scene turns oddly autonomous. A fragment of memory slides into an invented setting without resistance. What, in daylight, would seem absurd begins to feel natural. A hallway leads into a childhood home. A recent conversation continues with someone who has long been absent from your life. A problem from the day returns, but now it has become spatial, symbolic, physical. The mind is no longer merely reflecting on the world. It is beginning to fabricate experience from within. The border between thought and dream is porous, and it is this porosity that first tells us sleep is not an empty condition. It is an altered one. For much of human life, that was already enough to make sleep feel mysterious. A sleeping body could appear inert from the outside, yet the person within might be immersed in an experience rich with fear, tenderness, urgency, or confusion. One might wake with a racing heart from a danger that never existed, or with the afterglow of a conversation that never took place. A dream could leave behind relief, grief, shame, longing, or wonder, even after its details faded. It could seem trivial in content and enormous in feeling. That emotional residue mattered. Long before anyone could measure brainwaves or track muscle tone, dreams had already demonstrated something crucial about the mind. Inner experience can affect the body. An unreal event can provoke a real pulse, real tears, real dread. The sleeping mind is not cut off from human life. It reaches back into it. This is one reason dreams have always drawn so much attention. They are intimate, unstable, and strangely persuasive. While a dream is happening, the impossible can feel fully credible. One can accept broken time, altered identity, sudden transformation, and impossible geography without the kind of skepticism waking consciousness usually brings to bear. A stranger is instantly known. A dead relative is simply present. A city opens into a school corridor, and no alarm is raised. It is not merely that the dream is bizarre. It is that the mind accepts the bizarre with such confidence while the dream lasts. Something in the sleeping brain remains vividly capable of perception, reaction, and emotion, while something else that normally checks and organizes those experiences has changed. The dreamer sees, responds, fears, hopes, flees, desires, and suffers. Yet the standards by which reality is tested have been rearranged. From the outside, this is one of the most deceptively simple puzzles in science. A person appears asleep, but experiences continue. The senses no longer govern the mind in the same way, and yet the mind still constructs scenes, still feels, still moves through narratives of some kind. If the waking brain is a system continuously shaped by the external world, then what exactly happens when that contact loosens and inner life takes over more completely? How does the brain move from the clear orientation of wakefulness into the strange self-generated theater of dreaming? And why do certain faculties remain powerful while others dim? Why do emotion and imagery often survive so vividly, while skepticism and self-control seem to weaken? Questions like these do not arise only from philosophical curiosity. They arise from the ordinary experience of lying down at night and feeling the mind become other than itself. That may be why the threshold of sleep has always been such a fertile place for speculation, even without formal science. People could feel that this passage involved more than simple rest. The mind on the edge of sleep does not vanish. It changes texture. It becomes more fluid, more associative, less tethered to external fact. A small sound may enter a drifting thought and distort it rather than interrupt it. A sensation from the body may become part of an unfolding scene. A concern buried beneath the noise of the day may return not as a sentence, but as a place, a pursuit, a repetition, a figure at the edge of vision. The material of dreams often seems familiar, yet altered. It is borrowed from life, but translated into another language. That translation, once noticed, becomes difficult to ignore. It implies that the sleeping brain is not passive. It is reorganizing experience according to laws that waking consciousness does not fully understand. Modern science would eventually give those changing conditions names and measurements, but the lived experience came first. The subjective threshold between wake and sleep offer the earliest clues. In that interval, a person can sometimes watch attention slip from deliberate thought into something more image-like, more involuntary. The ordinary sense of time loosens. Internal speech grows strange. A scene may flash and vanish. A thought may abruptly become visual. This transitional mental life, often fleeting and hard to remember, hints at a larger truth. Consciousness is not one stable thing. It is capable of changing form while remaining, in some sense, present. Sleep does not merely remove the mind from the world. It rearranges the terms under which mind and world meet. That idea would eventually matter far beyond the study of dreams. It would matter to psychologists trying to understand buried emotion and symbolic thought. It would matter to neurologists asking how the brain maintains or alters conscious experience. It would matter to researchers of memory who would begin to suspect that the sleeping brain continues to process, sort, and reshape traces of the day. It would matter to philosophers of mind because dreams complicate any simple definition of consciousness as accurate awareness of reality. The dreamer is conscious in some sense, yet detached from the world that usually regulates conscious life. In dreams, the brain can construct a believable environment, populate it with people, bind it with mood, and place the self inside it, all while the body lies motionless in a darkened room. To understand that is not only to understand sleep, it is to understand something fundamental about the brain's power to create experience. Still, for a long time, those insights remained suggestive rather than measurable. Dreams presented a special difficulty. They were too vivid to dismiss, but too private to observe directly. A falling stone can be seen by anyone standing nearby. A disease can be examined in a body. Even a hidden star can be made public through an instrument. But a dream belongs first to one sleeping mind, and by morning, it has already begun to dissolve. The scientist who wishes to study it faces an immediate problem. The event cannot be watched in its own form from the outside. It must be inferred from traces, from the timing of awakening, from bodily signs, and above all from reports that are themselves fragile. By the time a dream is spoken aloud, it has already been translated by waking memory into language, sequence, and interpretation. Something original has been lost. This difficulty shaped the entire early life of the subject. Dreams occupied an unstable ground between inward experience and outward explanation. They could not be reduced to ordinary facts, yet they would not disappear. They returned night after night, private but universal. One person might forget almost everything by breakfast. Another might carry a dream for years. Some dreams borrowed lightly from daily life, while others seemed to expose older fears, unresolved emotion, or buried desires in disguised form. Some felt like nonsense. Others felt more meaningful than waking events. This variability made dreams difficult to discipline scientifically, but it also made them irresistible. They seemed to reveal that the mind possessed hidden layers, and that these layers became visible, or at least audible, when ordinary waking order receded. What makes this opening phase of the story so compelling is that dreams do not begin as a problem of theory. They begin as a change in experience that anyone can feel. The listener need not enter a laboratory to sense the underlying mystery. It is enough to lie still at night and notice how the mind starts to wander beyond intention. The transition is quiet, but it is not trivial. It is a daily demonstration that mental life can loosen from deliberate control and continue in altered form. Even before the first remembered dream, consciousness is already slipping into a different architecture. Thought is becoming image, memory is becoming setting, emotion is becoming atmosphere. The waking self, with its steady orientation to fact, is beginning to give way to another mode of being that is less stable, less critical, and perhaps, in some ways, more revealing. If the dreaming mind were merely chaotic, perhaps it would have inspired less sustained curiosity. But dreams are seldom pure noise. However distorted they may become, they often retain recognizable elements of human life. A familiar room, a repeated fear, an old attachment, a current worry, a wish, a humiliation, a voice, a face, a path, a test, a chase, a fall. The forms change, the logic bends, and yet the raw materials are unmistakably drawn from what it means to be human. This gave dreams an unusual status in the history of ideas. They seemed at once alien and intimate, as if the mind were showing itself under altered conditions, not in its well-lit, deliberate form, but in a looser and perhaps less censored one. that impression would prove powerful. It invited the suspicion that dreams were not random shadows, but clues. The more one reflects on them, the stranger they become. A dream can fabricate a place no one has ever seen, yet fill it with emotional certainty. It can distort a memory without erasing its force. It can make the dreamer passive in one scene and urgently active in the next. It can generate fear without a source, or give a source to fear that has long existed without one. Even the simplest nightmare demonstrates an important fact. The brain can construct a threat, believe in it, react to it bodily, and only later recognize that the entire event arose from within. That does not make the experience false in any trivial sense. The tiger may not have been there. The falling may not have occurred. The accusation may never have been spoken, but the terror was real. The awakening real. The body's alarm real. The dreaming brain is capable of producing consequences from internally generated worlds. This is where the topic begins to widen from personal strangeness into scientific importance. If the brain can create an entire field of experience while cut off from ordinary sensory reality, then dreaming is not a curiosity sitting at the margins of mental life. It is evidence of what the brain is always doing in one form or another, generating models, selecting what to believe, composing reality from available signals, memories, and expectations. Waking life is steadier because the world continuously corrects us. Dreams reveal what happens when that correction weakens. The brain does not fall silent. It keeps working with what remains, and what remains is enough to create landscapes, conversations, bodies, crises, stories, and selves. To study dreams, then, is partly to study what consciousness becomes when external constraint is reduced and internal generation comes forward. And yet the mystery remains tender at the edges. The threshold of sleep is not a spectacular event. It is ordinary. It happens in bedrooms, in dim apartments, in quiet houses, in dormitories, in trains, on sofas, in hospital beds, in childhood and old age, in health and illness, night after night. That ordinariness is part of what makes it profound. Science often advances by taking something commonplace and noticing that it is far stranger than anyone assumed. Falling asleep is one of the most ordinary things a human being does. But hidden inside that familiar passage is a change in brain and mind so subtle, so layered, and so difficult to capture that it would take generations of thinkers, physicians, psychologists, and neuroscientists to begin understanding even its outlines before instruments entered the story, before the sleeping brain could be tracked in electrical rhythms and bodily signs. Human beings had only the most immediate evidence to work with. They had the memory of dreams, the emotional after effects, the conviction that something meaningful or revealing might be happening when ordinary awareness withdrew. They had the sense, difficult to articulate but hard to deny, that sleep was not one blank condition, and that the mind at night was not simply absent. It was altered, sometimes beautifully, sometimes disturbingly, sometimes so convincingly that waking itself could feel, for a moment, like the stranger state. So we begin here, at the edge of sleep, before the laboratory, before the charts and the electrodes, before the brain was measured closely enough to reveal its hidden rhythms. We begin with the most immediate fact of all, that as the world fades, another kind of experience begins to gather, and that this experience has always invited explanation. The first attempts to answer it would not come from machines, but from interpretation, from the belief that dreams were not merely events of the night, but messages, symbols, and clues to the hidden life of the mind. And that is where the next part of our journey must go. And because that inward world could feel so vivid, so intimate, and at times so emotionally exact, the first modern attempts to understand it did not begin with instruments. They began with attention, with memory, with the strange conviction that what passed through the sleeping mind was not merely random, but somehow revealing. A dream might collapse by morning into fragments, yet still leave behind a pressure of meaning. A locked room, a missed appointment, a childhood staircase, a face that belonged to one person and another at once. These images did not arrive as clean arguments, but they did not feel empty either. They seemed assembled from the materials of life in a way that invited reading. Once people noticed that dreams borrowed from memory, desire, fear, embarrassment, and longing, it became almost inevitable that they would begin to treat them not simply as curiosities of the night, but as clues to the hidden life of the mind. That shift belonged to a broader movement in modern thought, one in which the self was becoming less transparent to itself. By the late 19th century, European intellectual life had grown increasingly interested in what lies beneath conscious intention. Hysterical symptoms, slips of the tongue, irrational phobias, obscure compulsions, forgotten memories, and sudden emotional storms all seemed to suggest that human beings were guided by processes they could not fully observe from within. In that climate, dreams acquired a new importance. They were not just dramatic nighttime episodes or literary symbols. They seemed to offer access to a part of mental life that waking reason did not govern very well. What made them especially powerful was that they came unbidden. A person could choose what to say in daylight, could revise a thought, suppress an impulse, compose a face for the social world, but dreams arrived without permission, and for that very reason, they began to look, to many thinkers, like unusually valuable evidence. No one gave that evidence a more ambitious form than Sigmund Freud. When he published The Interpretation of Dreams at the turn of the 20th century, he was not working in the settled science of sleep, because no such science yet existed. He was working instead in a world of patients, case histories, self-analysis, and clinical listening, trying to build a psychology deep enough to explain why the mind could produce thoughts, symptoms, and fantasies that its waking owner did not fully understand. Dreams became central to that effort, because they appeared to show the mind operating under altered conditions, less supervised, less polished, yet not without structure. Freud did not accept the easy answer that dreams were meaningless residue. He believed they were lawful formations, strange on the surface but organized beneath it. The dream, in his hands, became not an interruption of mental life, but one of its most revealing continuations. What gave Freud's approach its persuasive force was the way he linked the oddity of dreams to a more general theory of psychological conflict. If the mind contained wishes, memories, fears, and impulses that could not easily appear in waking consciousness, then sleep might provide them a different route. But that route, he argued, would not be direct. The dream would not simply announce its meaning plainly, it would disguise it. This was one of Freud's most enduring ideas, and one of the reasons his theory held such imaginative power. He distinguished between the manifest content of the dream, meaning the dream as it is remembered, with its images, scenes, and visible storyline, and the latent content, meaning the underlying wish or conflict that had been transformed in the process of becoming dream material. The absurdity of dreams, then, was not evidence of chaos. It was evidence of work. That dream work, as Freud described it, became one of the great interpretive engines of 20th century psychology. At first, he noticed that dreams often seemed to compress several ideas into one image, or to shift emotional intensity away from what ought to matter onto something seemingly trivial. A person important in waking life might appear only indirectly, while a minor object became strangely luminous. A fear about one event might emerge as a scene involving something else altogether. To account for this, Freud described mechanisms such as condensation and displacement. Condensation referred to the merging of several thoughts or associations into one dream figure or scene. Displacement described the transfer of emotional weight from a central concern onto something less obvious. These were not, in his view, decorative quirks. They were the means by which a sleeping mind could both express and conceal what it could not tolerate directly, seen from within the intellectual atmosphere of the time. This way of thinking had a remarkable elegance. It explained why dreams so often felt intimate without being easy to decode. It explained why absurdity and emotional force could coexist. It explained why dream images were rarely straightforward transcripts of daily life, and why what seemed nonsensical on the surface could still feel charged with personal significance. Freud's method of free association was built around this premise. Rather than interpreting dream symbols through a fixed universal code, at least in principle, he often asked the dreamer to follow the chain of thoughts connected to a particular image. What does this room remind you of? What does this person lead you to think of? Where have you felt this embarrassment before? The dream image was not the end point. It was the doorway. Once opened, it could lead back into memory, childhood conflict, thwarted desire, or emotional material that waking life kept in safer forms. This mattered because Freud's dream theory was inseparable from a much larger claim about human beings. He was not saying only that dreams are meaningful. He was saying that the self is divided, layered, and partly opaque to itself. The waking person, in his view, did not sit in full command of the mind. Conscious intention was real, but limited. Beneath it lay conflicts and wishes that continued to operate whether or not the conscious self approved. Dreams offered evidence for this because they seemed to reveal thoughts under a loosened regime of control. The standards of waking rationality had softened, the boundaries between memory and fantasy had thinned, and in that altered condition, something usually hidden could take symbolic form. This was why Freud could call dreams the royal road to the unconscious. He meant not that they were easy, but that they led inward more directly than many other phenomena of everyday life. It is easy now, from the distance of contemporary neuroscience, to hear these claims as grand, speculative, perhaps even overconfident. But to understand their historical force, one has to imagine the problem as it appeared then. The mind clearly did more than it confessed. Patients suffered from symptoms that did not submit to ordinary reasoning. Emotional life often behaved as though it had its own buried history. The logic of dreams, however strange, did not seem entirely arbitrary. Freud offered a system in which these facts could belong together. His theory gave hidden motivation a place, gave dream bizarreness a mechanism, and gave modern psychology a powerful narrative in which nothing mental was ever merely accidental. This was not only a scientific move. If science is the right word for all parts of it, it was also a transformation in sensibility. After Freud, many educated people came to feel that a dream could not simply be dismissed. It had to be asking for something. At the same time, Freud's theory contained difficulties that would matter more and more as psychology and physiology developed. The first difficulty was verification. Dream interpretation could be subtle, moving, and personally persuasive, but it was hard to test in the way later laboratory sciences would demand. One analyst might interpret a scene one way, another differently. A patient's associations might change over time. The same dream could be read through desire, fear, memory, trauma, or symbolic disguise depending on the framework brought to it. Freud knew that dream meaning was not reducible to a dictionary of symbols, but his alternative only deepened the challenge. If meaning depended on the dreamer's private associations and emotional history, then the evidence became deeply individual and hard to standardize. The method could illuminate, but it could also drift. That tension did not weaken the appeal of dream interpretation so much as define its peculiar strength. It was compelling precisely because it took subjective life seriously. A dream about missing a train, losing a child in a crowd, arriving unprepared for an examination, or wandering through a house that somehow contained parts of several different homes did not feel important because of its literal plot. It felt important because it seemed woven from the dreamer's own anxieties, attachments, memories, and emotional habits. Freud's approach honored that intuition. It treated the dream not as mechanical nonsense, but as a deeply human product assembled from lived material under altered conditions. In a time when much of science still struggled to approach inward life without flattening it, that was no small achievement. It gave the sleeping mind dignity, complexity, and interpretive weight. Freud was not entirely alone, of course, and part of the richness of this period lies in the fact that dreams attracted several overlapping traditions of thought. Some thinkers were less interested in disguised wish than in how dreams reworked memory. Others noticed continuities between dreaming and ordinary imagination, daydreaming, reverie, or creativity. Still others saw dream life as evidence that the mind could become more associative and less disciplined without losing all organization. These alternatives did not usually overthrow Freud in his own era, but they are worth remembering because they show the field was never as singular as later caricatures suggest. There was already a broader sense that dreams might tell us something basic about how the mind combines fragments, shifts, emotional emphasis, and loosens the grip of external reality. Freud became the dominant figure because his theory was bold enough to organize all of this into one commanding vision. The culture around him helped that vision take root. The early 20th century was unusually prepared to think in terms of hidden causes. In medicine, invisible pathogens had transformed the understanding of disease. In physics, unseen processes stood behind observable effects. In psychology, too, there was growing willingness to infer depth from surface, to suspect that what appeared simple might conceal elaborate internal machinery. Dreams were especially suitable for this mood because they already felt layered. Their surfaces were unstable, but their emotional undertones could be surprisingly coherent. A dream might place a person in an impossible landscape, yet the fear or longing running through it could feel exact. This combination of visual absurdity and emotional precision made dreams seem like the perfect evidence for a mind that works indirectly. One did not need to see the machinery to believe it was there. And yet the more dreams were used as evidence, the more another problem slowly came into view. If dreams were to become part of a modern science of mind, then meaning alone would not be enough. However rich an interpretation might be, it still left unanswered the question of when a dream was occurring, what state the sleeper's body was in, whether all sleep was alike, and whether certain kinds of dream experience might belong to certain bodily conditions more than others. The consulting room could treat dream reports as meaningful texts, but it could not yet observe the sleeping organism with any precision. There was no reliable way to know whether dreams clustered at particular moments in the night, whether they accompanied distinctive shifts in brain activity, or whether the strange logic of dreaming depended on identifiable physiological states. Interpretation could tell a story about what a dream might mean. It could not yet tell a story about how the dreaming condition itself was organized. This raised a subtle but decisive difference between two kinds of curiosity. One wanted to know what dreams meant to the person who had them. The other wanted to know what sort of brain and body could produce such experiences at all. For a time, these questions overlapped enough to coexist. After all, one could believe that dreams revealed hidden wishes and still wonder what sleep was doing physiologically. But over time, the balance would shift. As the ambitions of psychology became more experimental, as physiology gained more refined tools, and as the authority of measurable processes grew, the limitations of interpretation became harder to ignore. Freud had made dreams central. He had convinced modern thought that sleep was not a blank pause, but a zone of active mental life. In doing so, he had also ensured that later scientists would have to confront dreams seriously, whether to confirm, revise, or reject his conclusions. What is striking, looking back, is how much of the later field would still circle around the same basic features of dream experience that Freud found so important, even when the explanatory language changed completely. Why are dreams so selective in what they borrow from memory? Why are they often saturated with emotion? Why do they place the dreamer inside a world that feels real while it lasts, even when logic has loosened and time is disordered? Why does the mind, once partially released from waking constraints, continue to generate scenes rather than fall into total silence? Freud answered these questions with repression, wish, disguise, and psychic conflict. Later, scientists would answer with sleep stages, activation patterns, cortical integration, memory reprocessing, or changes in neuromodulation. But the enduring puzzle was often the same. Dreaming felt too patterned to be dismissed, and too strange to be taken at face value. This is why the interpretive era should not be treated as a dead prelude, useful only because science eventually moved beyond it. It was, in its own way, a serious attempt to honor what dreams felt like from the inside. It preserved the intimacy of the phenomenon. It recognized that the sleeping mind does not merely flicker with meaningless sparks, but tends to return, however indirectly, to the materials of a life, a recent embarrassment, an old room, a recurring fear, a forbidden wish, a half-forgotten voice. These things come back in altered form, and anyone trying to explain dreams would have to account for that recurrence somehow. Freud's vocabulary may no longer command the field as it once did, but the larger issue he emphasized remains unavoidable. Dreams are built from us, even when they do not present us plainly, and perhaps that was the real turning point. Once modern thinkers began to suspect that dreams were lawful formations of the mind rather than meaningless nocturnal debris, the subject could no longer remain at the margins. If dreams had structure, then that structure might eventually be studied more rigorously. If they were tied to the hidden life of memory and emotion, then perhaps they were also tied to hidden states of the body. If they seemed to emerge under regular conditions of sleep, then sleep itself might have an internal architecture waiting to be discovered. Interpretation had taken the dream seriously as a message. The next movement would take sleep seriously as a process. That movement would require a different kind of attention, quieter in one sense and more mechanical in another. Instead of listening first to associations and latent meanings, researchers would begin listening for rhythms, recording changes too subtle for unaided perception, watching the sleeper, not for symbolic clues, but for bodily signs. The dream would not disappear from view, but it would be approached from a new angle, one that asked not only what the sleeping mind expressed, but but how the sleeping organism changed over the course of a night. And as that shift began, another possibility came into focus. Perhaps sleep was not a single, undifferentiated state at all. Perhaps the brain, even in darkness, moved through hidden stages of its own. That possibility had been quietly waiting for the right kind of tool. As long as dreams were approached mainly through memory and interpretation, sleep itself remained strangely opaque, more like a blank backdrop than a process with its own changing structure. What researchers needed was some way to observe the sleeper without forcing the sleeper back into wakefulness, some method delicate enough to register change while the night continued undisturbed. The development of the electroencephalogram made that possible. When Hans Berger began recording electrical activity from the human scalp in the late 1920s, he was not yet opening the modern science of dreaming in its full form. But he was giving later researchers something essential, a way to see that the sleeping brain was not silent, and that its activity changed in patterned ways over time. Later, historical reviews of sleep science describe EEG as the turning point that allowed investigators to measure sleep depth and brain state without repeatedly waking the subject, and that single advance altered the entire field. At first, even this new ability did not instantly produce a full map of the night. Early researchers had to learn how to read the traces before they could use them well. Through the 1930s, investigators such as Loomis, Harvey, and Hobart, working with EEG, began to show that sleep unfolded in recognizable patterns rather than as one continuous descent into uniform quiescence. Certain rhythms appeared, faded, and gave way to others. The sleeper did not simply drop out of waking life and remain in one stable condition until morning. Instead, the brain seemed to pass through organized states, each with its own electrical signature. This was an important change in thought, even before dreaming was firmly tied to any one pattern. It meant that the sleeping brain could be studied as a sequence, almost as a hidden landscape of recurring forms. Sleep was no longer just what happened when consciousness withdrew. It had architecture. Once that architecture began to come into view, the older image of sleep as passive rest grew harder to maintain. The popular intuition had long been that the brain simply shut down at night, sinking into a quieter and duller condition from which it gradually re-emerged. Berger's own early recordings seemed at first to support part of this view, because certain waking rhythms diminished as sleep deepened. But over time, the finer structure of the traces suggested something more complicated. Different phases of the night had different qualities. Sleep could lighten and deepen. Rhythms could become faster or slower, more synchronized or less so. The body resting in bed might still look unchanged from the outside. Yet the brain was passing through a dynamic series of internal conditions. This did not yet explain dreams, but it prepared the ground for a different kind of question. If sleep was made of stages, might dreaming belong more strongly to some of them than to others? That question would find its decisive moment in Chicago in the early 1950s. Though it did not begin as a grand revelation, Nathaniel Kleitman had already devoted much of his career to the physiology of sleep and waking, and his laboratory was one of the rare places where sleep was being treated as a rigorous scientific subject. In that setting, Eugene Azarinsky, then a graduate student, began studying eye movements during sleep. This may seem like a modest line of inquiry, almost secondary beside the more obviously cerebral drama of EEG. Yet that modesty is part of what makes the discovery so revealing. Scientific revolutions often enter quietly. Through details that at first appear merely technical, Azarinsky observed repeated periods in which the sleeping eyes moved rapidly beneath closed lids, and these episodes were accompanied by changes in other physiological measures. The point was not only that the eyes moved, it was that they moved in recurring bouts, suggesting that something distinctive was happening during those intervals. When Azarinsky and Kleitman published their 1953 paper on regularly occurring periods of eye motility and related phenomena during sleep, they were doing more than describing an odd bodily event. They were identifying a sleep state that would force researchers to rethink the night from top to bottom. These episodes, later named rapid eye movement sleep, did not fit comfortably into the older image of sleep as a smooth gradient from light drowsiness to deeper repose. They returned cyclically. They brought with them changes in respiration and body motility. They suggested that the sleeper was, at certain moments, in a condition qualitatively different from the rest of the night. Historical accounts of the field often emphasize how startling this was. Sleep was not merely layered, it was alternating between states. The night had a rhythm more intricate than anyone had clearly demonstrated before. Even then, the connection to dreaming was not yet complete in the form later generations would remember. The early discovery opened a possibility, not an instant certainty. If rapid eye movements marked a special state, perhaps they were associated with vivid mental activity. But to move from possibility to stronger inference, researchers had to develop methods that linked physiology and report more directly. This was where William Dement became essential. Working with Kleitman, Dement helped show not only that sleep cycles through recurring non-REM and REM periods across the night, but also that awakenings from these eye movement-rich intervals yielded a high rate of dream reports. By 1957, Dement and Kleitman had produced work that historical reviews still treat as foundational because it transformed dreaming from a private recollection into something that could be studied objectively by timing awakenings to physiological state. That was the real methodological breakthrough. Dreams were still reported subjectively, but now the reports could be anchored to recurring biological conditions. This changed the scientific atmosphere immediately. For the first time, there seemed to be an objective doorway into one of the most private experiences in human life. The logic was powerful, in its first form, seductively clean. If rapid eye movement periods occurred in regular cycles, and if sleepers awakened during those periods, often reported vivid dream experiences, then perhaps the elusive question of dreaming had finally found its physiological key. One could now imagine a sleep laboratory not merely as a place where slumber was passively observed, but as a setting where the hidden timing of dream life could be tracked through the night. The consulting room had listened to the dream after waking. The laboratory could now, at least in principle, approach the dream as it was happening, or as near to that moment as the sleeping body would allow. A private theater had acquired a clock. Yet what made this period so fertile was not just the elegance of the new method, it was the way the discovery reorganized older questions. Dreams had been treated as messages, symbols, disguised wishes, fragments of hidden mental life. Now a different style of explanation began to rise alongside those interpretations. If dreaming clustered in REM, then perhaps it was not merely a text to be read, but a state to be analyzed. Why did the eyes move rapidly? Why did physiology shift in these intervals? Why did the dream reports from such awakenings seem especially vivid, story-like, and emotionally charged? The biological and the experiential were beginning to lock together. This did not settle what dreams meant, but it made their occurrence look less arbitrary and more state-dependent. A phenomenon once approached mainly through meaning was now being approached through timing, recurrence, and measurable bodily change. It is worth lingering over how radical this must have felt to those inside the field. A person lying in bed through the night might appear almost motionless, their experience inaccessible, their inward life hidden from everyone around them. Yet under the electrodes and recording devices, the night was becoming legible as a sequence. Certain periods brought slower, more synchronized activity. Others brought rapid eye movements, altered respiration, and a higher probability of recalled dreaming. Patterns repeated, cycles returned. Sleep could be charted not as a blank interval between two waking days, but as an internally organized process. This was one of the deepest transformations in 20th century sleep science. Once the night could be mapped, dreams were no longer floating free in anecdote. They began to belong to a physiology. At the same time, the new clarity carried its own temptations. It became easy, perhaps too easy, to slide toward the assumption that REM, sleep, and dreaming were essentially the same thing. The evidence strongly linked them, and for a field newly empowered by measurement, that link was exhilarating. But even in this early moment, the strongest researchers were not simply reducing dreams to eye movements. They were using REM as an entry point, a marker that could stabilize inquiry. What mattered was that sleep had revealed a hidden division in itself. There were different kinds of night different physiological modes through which the brain traveled. Dreaming now seemed to have a favored terrain within that journey, and that alone was enough to make older models of undifferentiated sleep look inadequate. The secret was not just that dreams existed, it was that the sleeping brain changed state in patterned ways, and those changes mattered. The laboratory methods of this era also reshaped the temperament of the field. Dream research could now become cumulative in a new sense. One could compare nights, subjects, timings, physiological traces, awakenings, and reports. Sleep medicine itself would eventually grow out of this broader transformation because polysomnographic recording, combining EEG with eye movements, muscle tone, and other physiological measures, became the major tool for diagnosing disorders of sleep. But within the narrower question of dreaming, the effect was equally profound. The dream was no longer only what a dreamer remembered upon waking naturally in the morning. It became something that could be sampled at experimentally chosen moments, correlated with measurable states, and placed into a systematic framework that did not make dream science easy, but it made it possible in a way it had never been before. There was, however, one more reason the discovery of REM carried such intellectual force. It suggested that the brain in sleep might not simply fade from wakefulness into lesser forms of itself, but might generate states with their own paradoxical qualities. Some periods looked quieter and more synchronized. Others seemed physiologically more activated, as though the sleeper had entered a vivid internal mode while remaining outwardly asleep. The old opposition between wakefulness and sleep was beginning to break down. Night was not the absence of mental life. It was a structured alternation between different regimes of brain activity, some of them more compatible with dream experience than others. That insight would eventually lead researchers deeper toward questions not only of when dreams occur, but of what kind of brain produces them, and how such a brain can be deeply asleep in one sense while intensely active in another. The discovery of REM opened that path, but it did not exhaust it. It simply illuminated the entrance. And so the night, once thought of as a descent into uniform stillness, had revealed its first great secret. Beneath closed eyelids and the outward calm of the sleeping body, the brain was moving through an organized sequence, returning again and again to a peculiar state in which the conditions for vivid dreaming seemed especially strong. The traces on paper had done more than classify sleep. They had made the hidden theater of the night partially visible, yet the more visible it became, the stranger it looked. For if one phase of sleep could resemble mental intensity while the body remained at rest, then the next step would require scientists to confront a deeper paradox, one that would define the field for decades to come. They would have to ask what kind of sleep could contain a brain so active, a body so still, and a dream so alive. That question led naturally toward a figure who would become central to the biology of dreaming, though he entered this story from a slightly different direction. In France, during the 1950s and 1960s, Michel Jouvet was studying sleep with the methods of neurophysiology and lesion research, looking not only at the surface rhythms of the night, but at the deeper mechanisms that might produce them. By then, the discovery of rapid eye movement sleep had already made clear that the night was divided into recurring states. Yet a state defined only by eye movements and EEG patterns still left something essential unexplained. What kind of organism was the sleeper during those intervals? What happened to posture, movement, sensory thresholds, the relation between brain and body? Jouvet's work helped reveal that REM sleep was not simply another stage in a linear descent into rest. It was something more peculiar, a condition in which the brain and body entered an arrangement so unusual that he would call it paradoxical sleep. The paradox was not rhetorical, it was physiological. During these periods, the sleeper's brain activity could resemble wakefulness in important ways, with fast, desynchronized EEG patterns that looked unlike the slower, more synchronized rhythms of deeper, non-REM sleep. The eyes moved rapidly. The autonomic system could become more variable. Dream reports on awakening were often vivid, emotional, and dramatic, and yet the body itself, instead of preparing to act on this intense inner life, was profoundly inhibited. Muscle tone dropped to strikingly low levels. The organism was in one sense deeply asleep, and in another sense internally active. This combination had no easy equivalent in everyday experience. A mind seemed alive within a body deliberately held back. It was this coupling that made REM such a strange kingdom within the night. In waking life, vivid perception, emotion, and movement usually belong together. If something startles you, the body responds. If a threat appears, muscles prepare for action. If attention sharpens, posture changes, the eyes orient, the body enters the scene. But in REM sleep, much of that usual chain is interrupted. The dreamer may be running, falling, arguing, flying, hiding, or reaching, yet the body remains almost entirely still. The eyes flicker under closed lids, the brain pulses with internal activity, and yet the skeletal muscles of the body are held under a powerful inhibition. Sleep has not merely quieted the organism, it has reorganized it. The sleeper inhabits a world of action while the physical body is, by design, restrained from joining in. Jouvet approached this not as a poet of consciousness, but as an experimental physiologist. Working largely with cats, he used careful lesion studies and brain recordings to show that paradoxical sleep depended on specific brainstem mechanisms. This mattered because it shifted the study of dreaming away from surface description and toward causal architecture. One could now ask not only what REM looked like from the outside, or how often dreams were reported from it, but what circuits in the nervous system were responsible for the state itself. Jouvet identified regions in the pontine brainstem involved in generating REM sleep and, just as importantly, in producing the muscle atonia that accompanies it. His work suggested that the bizarre alliance of vivid interactivity and bodily paralysis was not incidental. It was built into the biology of the state. This made REM more intelligible, but also more unsettling. If the body was being actively prevented from moving during dreams, then dreaming itself could no longer be imagined as a purely passive byproduct of sleep. The state had to be coordinated. The brain was not simply drifting through images, while the body happened to remain relaxed. It was entering a distinct mode in which activation and inhibition were both tightly organized. Certain systems were becoming more engaged, others less. Some thresholds were rising, others falling. From the point of view of evolution and survival, the arrangement made sense. An animal that physically enacted every dream would place itself in danger. The dream could proceed internally because the body had been placed under temporary restraint. Yet from the standpoint of ordinary intuition, this only deepened the mystery. Why should the brain produce such vivid experiences at precisely the time when the body is least available to carry them out? The physiological answer was beginning to take shape, but the phenomenological answer remained open. Anyone awakened from REM sleep often described not just scattered imagery, but a world. There were places, events, tensions, goals, dangers, reunions, embarrassments, physical environments, other people, and above all, a strong sense of being inside an unfolding scene, rather than merely thinking abstractly. The dream often had momentum. Something was happening. The self might be unstable, logic might bend, memory might be distorted, but the dreamer was rarely experiencing mere emptiness. This was what made REM sleep more than a technical curiosity. It was one thing to say that the brainstem generated a distinct sleep state. It was another to realize that within that state, consciousness itself could take on a highly immersive narrative form while remaining detached from external reality. That detachment is one of the deepest features of the REM world. In wakefulness, perception and reality are linked by continual correction. The world resists what is untrue. A door is either open or closed. A face either belongs to the person before you or it does not. If you imagine a cliff in the room does not reorganize itself to accommodate your fear. In dreams, that corrective dialogue with the outside world weakens almost completely. The brain is free to generate a scene from memory, emotion, expectation, and association, and then to accept that scene as the present environment. What REM sleep seemed to offer researchers, then, was a naturally recurring state in which the brain could construct experience from largely internal sources. The sleeping mind did not merely lose the world, it replaced it. This helps explain why REM became so important not only to sleep physiology, but to the broader study of consciousness. Here was a state in which experience remained vivid, emotionally alive, and often perceptually rich. Even though the usual anchors of waking cognition had shifted, attention was different. Critical reasoning was weakened. Time and place were unstable, yet experience still existed, often in abundance. That fact challenged any simple picture of consciousness as accurate awareness of an external environment. Consciousness, the sleeping brain seemed to suggest, could survive in altered forms. It could become hallucinatory, self-generated, internally staged, and still remain experientially real to the person inside it. To understand REM was therefore not only to understand a phase of sleep, it was to approach a different answer to the question of what a mind can be. Over time, this pushed the science of dreams toward a more nuanced vocabulary. REM sleep was not just deep sleep or light sleep. It was a mixed condition, one in which signs that usually belong to very different modes of life came together. The EEG looked in some respects wake-like. The body was deeply disengaged from voluntary movement. The autonomic system could show bursts of variability. Dream reports were often intense and immersive. Some researchers later described REM as a state of internal activation combined with external disconnection. Others preferred to emphasize its hybrid structure, noting that it seemed to splice together features of arousal, sensory isolation, motor inhibition, and mental vividness. However one phrased it, the underlying point was the same. REM was strange because it did not sit comfortably within ordinary binaries. It was neither simple rest nor waking consciousness, neither mental silence nor physical action. It was a third condition with rules of its own. The importance of atonia within this condition became especially clear through what happened when it failed. Jouvet's animal studies showed that if certain brainstem mechanisms were disrupted, the sleeping animal could begin to move during paradoxical sleep, displaying behaviors that appeared linked to dream enactment. This line of work would eventually help later clinicians understand REM sleep behavior disorder, in which the protective inhibition of muscle tone breaks down and sleepers physically act out elements of their dreams. But even before the clinical significance became fully recognized, the experimental lesson was profound. The stillness of the REM body was not accidental relaxation. It was an active part of the state. Remove that restraint, and the boundary between dreamed action and bodily action begins to collapse. The sleeping organism, it turned out, was being protected from its own inner world. That discovery had an almost philosophical resonance, because it meant that dreaming was not just an affair of images or thought. It involved the whole relation between mind and body. In REM sleep, the brain did not merely create a story for a passive observer. It created an active environment for a temporarily immobilized self. The dreamer runs without running, speaks without speaking, touches without moving, sees without opening the eyes to the room, feels danger without any actual predator present. The body, meanwhile, is neither wholly absent nor fully engaged. Heart rate can shift, breathing can change, sexual arousal may occur. The organism is not inert, only selectively disconnected. Certain systems remain alive to the drama, others are intentionally prevented from entering it. The result is a state that feels, from within, more embodied than pure thought, and from without, more restrained than waking life. One of the quiet consequences of this research was that it changed the emotional meaning of sleep itself. Before the science of REM, it was possible to imagine the night as a kind of general dimming, interrupted now and then by dreams whose timing and biological basis remained obscure. After REM research matured, the night looked less like a slope and more like a cycle, a repeated movement into and out of an internally activated world. This gave dreams a rhythm. They were not simply chance eruptions. They belonged to the architecture of the night, returning in relation to recurring brain states. The sleeper's journey no longer appeared homogeneous. It had chambers, and REM was one of the most distinctive among them, a recurrent interval during which the mind often entered its most vivid theater. That theater, however, was not identical to a waking imagination. A person daydreaming remains tethered, however loosely, to the surrounding world. They can choose to reorient. They can often reflect, revise, and compare thought against environment. In REM sleep, those powers are altered. The dreamer usually lacks the firm reflective stance that would allow the dream to be recognized as dream. This is part of what gives the REM world its conviction. The images are not merely produced, they are inhabited. A body at rest can nevertheless experience pursuit, shame, ecstasy, grief, surprise, and danger as if the situation were immediate. The dream, therefore, offers a powerful natural example of how reality, at the level of experience, depends not only on the world outside, but on the brain's way of organizing its own signals. When the usual sensory governance of waking life is reduced, the internally generated model can take command. Researchers did not all agree on how far one should go in linking REM sleep and dreaming, and later work would complicate the early equation between them. But in this stage of the story, REM still felt like the great doorway. It supplied an objective foothold in a field that had long relied on interpretation and recollection. One could now point to a state, describe its physiology, trace some of its generating mechanisms, and link it with a high probability of vivid dream reports. That did not settle the meaning of dreams, nor the function of REM, nor the exact relation between the two, yet it brought dream research into a different scientific maturity. The sleeping brain was no longer only a black box producing stories. It was a dynamic system, passing repeatedly into a distinctive mode of internally vivid, externally disconnected consciousness. As this understanding grew, another implication slowly became harder to ignore. If REM sleep was generated by specific brainstem systems and carried with it such a peculiar blend of activation and inhibition, perhaps the content of dreams itself might arise from those physiological conditions, rather than from hidden symbolic intention. Perhaps the odd logic of dreams, their vivid images, their emotional intensity, and their unstable settings were not simply messages in disguise, but expressions of a brain operating under unusual internal rules. This was not yet the fully articulated theory it would later become, but the ground was being prepared. Once a state is understood biologically, the temptation grows to interpret its experiences biologically as well. For the moment, though, REM remained most compelling in its immediate contradiction. It showed that the night contained a form of consciousness more active than anyone had guessed, and more carefully regulated than anyone had assumed. The dreamer was not merely asleep. The dreamer was passing through a state in which the brain could behave, in some respects, as if awake, while the body remained protected by immobility and the external world fell away from control. This was why the term paradoxical sleep endured. It named not a poetic mystery, but a genuine physiological one. The deeper researchers looked, the less sleep resembled simple rest. It resembled a sequence of biological strategies, and REM was among the most extraordinary. That, in turn, made the next intellectual shift almost unavoidable. Once scientists had found a state in which the brain was active, the body was still, and dreams were common. They had to ask whether the dream itself might be the mind's way of making sense of that internally generated activity. Perhaps the bizarre landscapes and sudden transformations of dreams were not only personal in origin, nor only symbolic in intention, but partly the consequence of a brain-constructing experience under altered physiological conditions. The sleeper had entered a kingdom with its own laws. The next task would be to ask whether those laws could explain not just when dreams happen, but why they feel the way they do. That possibility began to attract a different kind of thinker, one less satisfied with asking what dreams meant than with asking how they were generated at all. Once REM sleep had been identified as a distinctive physiological state, and once its association with vivid dreaming had become difficult to ignore, the old interpretive model no longer stood alone. A new scientific mood entered the field, shaped by the broader ambitions of late 20th century neuroscience. If the brain could be shown to pass through recurring states during the night, perhaps the peculiar form of dream experience belonged first to those states, and only secondarily to any symbolic meaning a dreamer might later attach to it. In that atmosphere, the dream no longer appeared only as a private text awaiting interpretation. It began to look like a product of neural conditions, and the next question became harder to avoid. If REM sleep alters the brain so profoundly, might dreaming be the mind's attempt to make sense of that altered activity as it unfolds? This was the setting in which J. Allen Hobson and Robert McCarley introduced one of the most influential and controversial theories in the modern history of dreaming. By the 1970s, neuroscience had grown more confident in linking mental events to brain mechanisms, and Hobson, trained in psychiatry but deeply engaged with neurobiology, was part of that shift. He and McCarley were not content simply to say that REM and dreaming were associated. They wanted a causal model that could explain why dreams take the form they do. The older language of hidden wish and symbolic disguise seemed, to them, too dependent on interpretation after the fact. What they sought instead was an account grounded in physiology, one that began not with the meaning of the dream narrative, but with the brainstem events that might be driving it. Their proposal would become known as the activation synthesis hypothesis, and it marked a decisive change in how many scientists imagined the dreaming mind. At first, the appeal of the model lay in its simplicity. During REM sleep, Hobson and McCarley argued, the brainstem generates bursts of internally driven activity that ascend toward higher cortical regions. The forebrain, receiving this strange mixture of signals in a state already cut off from normal sensory input and rational oversight, does what the brain so often does. It tries to organize them. It synthesizes them into a coherent if unstable experience. In this view, the dream is not primarily a disguised message from the unconscious in the older psychoanalytic sense. It is the cortex making the best of a peculiar internal situation. Images, narratives, abrupt transitions, emotional intensity, and bizarre combinations arise because the brain is attempting to weave scattered, internally generated activation into something that feels like a world. The dream, then, is not simply read, it is built. The theory carried a certain intellectual elegance because it explained several familiar features of dream life at once. Dreams are often vivid yet unstable, dramatic yet poorly reasoned, immersive yet loosely organized. They can be rich in movement and emotion while lacking the reflective control of waking thought. Hobson and McCarley suggested that these qualities follow naturally from the physiological conditions of REM. The sensory input from the external world is reduced. Voluntary motor output is largely blocked. Brainstem activation patterns stimulate higher regions in ways unlike ordinary waking perception. Neurochemical balances also shift, with aminergic systems that support certain forms of waking cognition relatively less active during REM. Under those conditions, the forebrain still does what it is built to do. It interprets, integrates, fills gaps, and imposes narrative order, but it does so on material that is internally generated, fragmentary, and unconstrained by the usual logic of the waking environment. What made activation synthesis feel so revolutionary was not only that it offered a mechanism, but that it quietly demoted the dreamer's later interpretation of the dream. A person might wake and feel that the dream had deep symbolic meaning, and perhaps in some personal sense it did, but for Hobson and McCarley, the first scientific task was to explain why any dreamlike experience arose at all. Their answer was that the sleeping forebrain was being activated from below, and then trying to synthesize that activation into perceptual and narrative form. And in that sense, the dream was not a message hidden inside disguise. It was an improvisation. The dreaming brain was like an organ forced to compose coherence from noisy internal prompts, drawing on memory, imagination, and emotion, not because it intended to confess some secret, but because those were the materials available for making experience out of excitation. This was more than a technical change in theory. It was a shift in intellectual style. Freud and those who followed him had taken the surface strangeness of dreams as evidence of disguised psychological depth. Hobson and McCarley took the same strangeness as evidence of unusual brain dynamics. Where psychoanalysis often moved downward into hidden wish and conflict, activation synthesis moved downward into circuitry, firing patterns, and state-dependent neurophysiology. It did not deny that dream content often includes emotional and biographical material. That would have been impossible to deny. But it changed the explanatory priority. The dream no longer began with meaning and then sought a mechanism. It began with mechanism, and meaning, if it existed, became secondary or derivative. This reversal was one reason the theory felt so cold to some and so liberating to others. To understand why the model gained such traction, it helps to remember how promising REM research had already made a physiological approach seem. Sleep was now measurable. REM could be identified repeatedly across the night. Dream reports from REM awakenings were common and often elaborate. Brainstem research suggested that REM depended on specific neural systems. In that context, activation synthesis appeared to pull several lines of evidence together into one coherent frame. The state is generated biologically. The signals rise from lower structures. The forebrain, cut off from the world and from ordinary waking constraints, interprets them. As a result, dreams are strange because their source conditions are strange. The dreamer's sense that the dream means something may itself be part of the brain's deep tendency to impose pattern, causality, and narrative where it can. In other words, the same organ that constructs waking reality from sensory input may be constructing dream reality from internally produced activation. There was something almost philosophical in that claim because it touched a question larger than dreaming. How much of what we take to be reality, even while awake, depends on the brain's constant work of interpretation and synthesis. Activation synthesis did not say that waking life is merely a dream, but it did make the continuity between dreaming and perception easier to see. In both cases, the brain is not passively receiving a world, it is constructing an organized experience from available inputs. The difference is that in dreaming, the inputs are largely internal, the external corrections are greatly reduced, and the resulting world therefore becomes more fluid, bizarre, and emotionally labile. What appears as the irrationality of dreams may then reflect not the collapse of all order, but the normal constructive work of the brain operating under unusual constraints. Even so, the theory immediately raised tensions of its own. One difficulty lay in the very boldness that made it memorable. If dreams are essentially the cortex's attempt to synthesize random or quasi-random brainstem activation, does that mean dream content is largely meaningless in psychological terms? Hobson's early formulation was often taken that way, and some of his critics believed it dismissed too quickly the evident recurrence of personal themes, emotional preoccupations, and autobiographical materials in dream life. After all, dreams rarely consist of pure nonsense, however distorted they become. They often return to familiar concerns, relationships, anxieties, and wishes. To many observers, it seemed too simple to treat these patterns as merely incidental decoration layered over physiological noise. The cortex may be improvising, but why does it so often improvise from the materials of the dreamer's actual life? This was where the debate became more subtle than the polemics that sometimes surrounded it. Hobson and McCarley did not need to deny that dream content was drawn from memory and emotion. In fact, the synthesis process more or less required that it be drawn from those sources. What they challenged was the idea that dream bizarreness must reflect disguise for latent symbolic meaning. The brain, in their model, uses what is available: memory fragments, emotional residues, familiar faces, spatial schemas, unresolved concerns, and recent impressions all become material for synthesis because they are stored within the system that is trying to organize internally generated activation. A dream can therefore be deeply personal without being coded in the Freudian sense. It may reveal the architecture of the mind, not because it hides a wish beneath a symbol, but because it shows what the brain reaches for when it must invent a world on short notice from within itself. The more one looks at actual dreams, the more intelligible this becomes. A person dreams of an unfamiliar building that somehow carries traces of several real places at once. The emotional tone belongs to a current fear, while the faces come from different decades of life. An argument with one person unfolds in the voice of another. A scene of public embarrassment borrows its setting from school, its anxiety from work, and its emotional intensity from something older and less clearly named. Freud had explained such mixtures through condensation, displacement, and hidden wish. Activation synthesis explained them through the brain's constructive attempt to integrate multiple activated memory and affective elements into a plausible, ongoing scene. The visible dream, then, is not an encoded text but an emergent product. It is what the mind looks like when it is making experiential order from unstable inner material. By the 1980s and 1990s, Hobson continued refining these ideas, in part because the early model, for all its influence, was sometimes read too narrowly. Over time, he moved toward broader frameworks that treated consciousness as changing along dimensions of activation, input source, and neuromodulation. This eventually became the AIM model, which proposed that mental states could be described by how activated the brain was, whether input came more from the external world or from internal sources, and what neuromodulatory balance supported cognition in that state. Our REM dreaming occupied a very particular place in that map. Activation was relatively high. Input was largely internal. Neurochemical conditions differed sharply from waking life. This broader formulation helped show that activation synthesis was not only a theory of dreams, but part of a larger attempt to chart the varieties of consciousness itself. That was important because it softened the crude contrast sometimes drawn between meaningful dreams and meaningless brain noise. Hobson's later work, while still firmly anti-Freudian in many respects, acknowledged that dreams could have coherence and even personal significance without requiring symbolic disguise as their primary explanation. The brain's synthesis is not necessarily random. It draws from stored experience, from affective salience, from available schemas of place, self, and social interaction. The dream can therefore reveal patterns of concern and memory, but what it reveals is filtered through the constraints and opportunities of a particular brain state. This is a more physiologically grounded view of meaning. The dream means something, perhaps because the brain is always using emotionally marked material when it constructs experience, but that does not mean the dream is best understood as a secret message waiting to be decoded. For many scientists, this felt like a healthier explanatory balance. It allowed dream research to remain close to measurable biology, while still respecting the lived texture of dreaming. It also aligned with a broader change in late 20th century science, in which the brain increasingly came to be seen as an active generator of experience rather than a passive receiver of stimuli. Dreams were a natural place for this insight to flourish, because they offered a vivid case in which the generative power of the brain stood almost naked, with the outside world largely absent and the resulting experience still compelling. In the dream, the brain shows one of its fundamental capacities. It can build a world from within, populate it, move a self through it, and temporarily persuade that self that the world is real. Still, the activation synthesis hypothesis never escaped criticism, and some of those criticisms were fertile rather than destructive. One concern was that the model seemed too strongly brainstem-centered, as though the essential story of dreaming began below, and the forebrain merely cleaned up the result. But some dream phenomena appeared richer, more emotionally and motivationally structured than a simple downstream synthesis from random activation would suggest. Another concern was that REM sleep itself might not be the whole story, especially as evidence accumulated that dream reports can also be obtained from non-REM sleep under the right conditions. These issues did not erase Hobson's contribution. On the contrary, they showed how influential it had become once he had shifted the field toward mechanism. Later critics had to argue with him on mechanistic grounds. What remained undeniable was the intellectual force of the reversal he had helped engineer. Dreams were no longer protected from physiology by their intimacy. Their closeness to subjective life no longer exempted them from causal explanation. The sleeping brain had become a laboratory for understanding how experience can be generated under altered conditions, and activation synthesis offered one of the first bold modern accounts of how that generation might occur. It said, in effect, that the dream's strange logic belongs not to some hidden symbolic code, but to the ordinary constructive habits of the brain operating in an extraordinary state. That was a powerful idea, because it relocated dream bizarreness from the realm of mystery to the realm of process. And yet, even within that relocation, something unresolved remained. If the dream is a synthesis of internally generated activation, then who or what gives the synthesis its emotional direction? Why do some dreams feel so saturated with desire, fear, shame, or longing? Why do certain themes recur with such stubborn force? Why does the dream sometimes seem less like a random collage and more like a state organized around motivational tension, unfinished concern, or the felt presence of the self moving through a world that matters? These questions lingered at the edges of activation synthesis from the beginning, and over time they would draw researchers toward a different emphasis, one that returned to the forebrain, to emotion, and to the possibility that dreaming is not merely the cortex explaining noise to itself, but the sleeping self expressing deeper systems of value and drive. For the moment, though, the field had unmistakably crossed a threshold. The dream was no longer a royal road to the unconscious, in the old interpretive sense. It had become a test case for a more austere and, in some ways, more modern idea. The brain does not wait for external reality to give it something to experience. It is capable of generating experience on its own, then trying to make that experience coherent as it unfolds. In the strange kingdom of REM, that power becomes especially visible. The next step would be to ask whether the forebrain was doing more than merely imposing order on chaos, and whether the dreamer inside the dream was more than a passive witness. And yet the very success of that physiological turn carried within it a new discomfort. If the dream were simply the cortex arranging strange brainstem signals into a temporary world, then one would expect something about dream life to feel thinner, more arbitrary, less inwardly directed than it often does. But many dreams do not feel like passive reactions to neural noise. They feel organized around urgency. They circle humiliation, desire, danger, longing, unfinished conflict, repeated fear. Even when the setting is unstable and the logic distorted, the emotional center can be surprisingly coherent. This was the weakness some researchers began to sense in the most brainstem-centered versions of dream theory. The mechanism was elegant, but perhaps too elegant. It explained why dreams might be bizarre, yet seemed less able to explain why they so often seem to belong so intimately to a person's inner life. That tension set the stage for one of the most important challenges to the activation synthesis model, and it came not from a return to classical psychoanalysis in its original form, but from neuropsychology. Mark Solms, trained in neuropsychology and psychoanalytic thought, entered the field with a question that was both old and newly sharpened. If dreaming depends mainly on REM generating mechanisms in the brainstem, then damage to those mechanisms should abolish dreams. And if dreaming is mainly a bottom-up byproduct of REM activation, then lesions in higher associative and motivational regions should matter less. Solms approached this not through speculation alone, but through lesion evidence, looking at what happened to dream life when particular parts of the brain were damaged. It was a different kind of method from both Freud's interpretive case history and Hobson's physiological modeling. It asked the brain, through its losses, what dreaming required. The results were unsettling for any theory that equated dreaming too tightly with REM mechanisms alone. Solms reported that some patients with damage affecting the classic REM generating regions could still dream, while some patients with lesions in forebrain areas lost dreaming or showed profound reductions in it. Even when aspects of REM physiology remained, this did not mean REM ceased to matter. It clearly mattered, but it suggested that REM and dreaming might not be identical phenomena, and that the brain structures necessary for generating dream experience could include higher regions involved in motivation, imagery, and the organization of subjective life. The dream, in other words, might not simply arise because the brainstem had activated the cortex. It might depend on specific forebrain systems that gave internal experience its drive, direction, and human significance. This mattered because it changed the location of the mystery. Under the strongest versions of activation synthesis, the essential drama seemed to begin below, in subcortical and brainstem processes, with the forebrain joining later to assemble coherence. Solms shifted attention upward and inward. He argued that dreaming was linked to dopaminergic and motivational systems in the forebrain, especially networks involved in desire, seeking, and affective direction. That made a great deal of phenomenological sense. Dreams are not merely moving pictures. They are usually experiences in which something is wanted, feared, pursued, avoided, or emotionally inhabited. A person searches, escapes, hides, arrives too late, loses something, tries to speak, tries to reach someone, fails an exam, reunites with the dead, protects a child, or wanders through spaces charged with expectation. These are not only perceptual events, they are motivated ones. Once that point was seen clearly, the debate could no longer remain a simple contest between symbolic meaning and random activation. The terms had shifted. The question was no longer just whether dreams are encoded wishes or cortical syntheses of brainstem signals. It became a question about the systems that generate subjectivity under sleeping conditions. Which neural networks are necessary for the feeling of being a self inside a dream, moving through a world structured by concern? Which parts of the brain contribute not just image and scene, but urgency, value, salience, and perspective? A dream may be visually strange, but what gives it its grip is often not the scenery alone. It is the fact that something matters within it. Solmes's work made that mattering scientifically visible in a new way. At first, this looked to some like a simple return of Freud in neurological dress, but the reality was more interesting and more restrained. Solmes did not need to restore every element of classical wish fulfillment theory in order to argue that dreaming is tied to motivational systems, nor did he need to claim that every dream is a symbolic confession. What returned, instead, was a more modest, but still profound idea. The dreaming brain may be structured not only by activation and synthesis, but by effective direction. The self that dreams is not a neutral spectator arranging noise. It is a being with drives, emotional priorities, and patterns of concern, and those may help shape dream life from the inside. In that sense, meaning re-entered dream science, but not primarily as a hidden code. It re-entered as value, salience, and desire embedded in neurobiology. The forebrain mattered for another reason as well. Dreaming is not just feeling. It is also scene construction, self-location, memory mixture, and imaginative world building. The cortical systems that support these functions in waking life do not vanish during sleep. They operate under altered conditions. Some are loosened, some are biased, some are deprived of external correction, but the capacities themselves remain. Lesion evidence suggested that when certain associative regions were damaged, dream imagery and dreaming itself could be profoundly altered or lost. This implied that dreaming required more than generalized arousal. It required the participation of structures capable of generating internal scenes and situating the dreamer within them. A dream is not just a pulse of emotion. It is an emotionally organized model of experience, and building such a model appears to draw on systems higher than the brainstem alone. This broadened the field's understanding of causation. A state like REM might provide favorable physiological conditions for dreaming, but the content and presence of dream experience could depend on additional networks that transform activation into a lived world. The brainstem could still set the conditions, but the forebrain might supply the drama, the self, the motivational arc. This was not merely a compromise between rival camps. It was a more layered vision of dream generation. Different levels of the brain might be contributing different kinds of necessity. One system helps produce the sleep state. Another supplies imagery. Another shapes salience and emotion. Another weakens critical control. Another supports the sense of being somewhere and pursuing something. Dreaming, in this framework, becomes less like a single mechanism and more like a temporary coalition among altered systems. That idea was strengthened by the very texture of dream reports. If one listens closely to how people describe dreams, one hears again and again not only bizarre perception, but directed involvement. The dreamer is rarely a detached observer, even when events are disjointed. The dreamer is usually implicated. Something threatens, seduces, embarrasses, compels, or demands response. The self may change shape, identity may blur, but a center of concern remains. This is one reason dreams can feel so personally exposing even when their narratives make little waking sense. They are organized less by rational explanation than by emotional force. Solmes's emphasis on motivational circuits gave science a way to take that seriously without abandoning neurobiological rigor. The dream's emotional architecture was not an embarrassment to theory. It was a clue to the systems involved. Over time, this also encouraged researchers to distinguish more carefully between REM sleep as a physiological state and dreaming as a form of conscious experience. The two overlap strongly, but they are not perfectly identical. Dreams can occur outside REM. REM can occur without a rich, remembered dream report. This does not weaken the importance of REM, but it does complicate the old simplification. If dream experience depends on the interplay of multiple systems, then no single physiological marker can wholly define it. This led the field toward a more refined question. Instead of asking only, during what state do dreams occur most often, researchers increasingly asked, what brain conditions are sufficient for dream consciousness to arise? The shift may sound subtle, but it changed everything. Dreaming was no longer just a feature of a sleep stage. It became a problem in the neural basis of conscious experience. This is where the issue of selfhood became more central. In waking life, the self usually feels continuous, reflective, and situated in a stable body moving through a stable world. In dreams, many of these features are altered, but not erased. The self may be less critical, less autobiographically coherent, less aware of contradiction, but it is still usually there in some form, perceiving, wanting, fearing, choosing, or at least undergoing. That persistence is scientifically important. It implies that the dream state preserves a functional core of subjectivity, even while many waking capacities are diminished. The dreamer may not know they are dreaming, may accept impossibilities, may shift identity fluidly, yet there is still an inner point of view from which the dream is lived. Any complete theory of dreaming must therefore explain not just images and activation, but the maintenance of a point of view under altered neural conditions. Once one sees the problem in those terms, the forebrain begins to look less like an optional storyteller and more like part of the essential infrastructure of dream subjectivity. Regions involved in self-representation, scene construction, emotion, and motivational relevance are not accessories to dreaming. They are among the reasons the dream feels like anything at all. A world without a self inside it is not a dream in the ordinary sense. A dream needs perspective. However unstable, it needs an experiencing center. It needs some continuity of concern. It needs the ability to treat internally generated events as happening to someone. The question who is dreaming in there is therefore not metaphorical. It is a genuine neuropsychological question. Which systems allow an internal model of self to persist when waking orientation has faded? This did not mean the brainstem became irrelevant. On the contrary, the field's most mature understanding increasingly depended on avoiding false either-or choices. Brainstem systems contribute crucially to REM state generation and aspects of bodily regulation. Forebrain systems contribute to imagery, value, selfhood, and the organization of experience. The real issue became how these levels interact. A dream may begin under the permissive conditions of REM, but the world of the dream, its emotional gravity, its peculiar mixture of memory and invention, may be shaped by systems that do far more than synthesize random input. They may select according to salience, respond according to effective priorities, and generate narratives around motivational tensions that the sleeping self cannot simply dismiss. In this more complex view, dreaming is neither mere disguise nor mere noise. It is an altered mode of subjectivity, built by multiple brain systems, working under special nocturnal constraints. This richer picture also helps explain why certain kinds of dream experience recur with such persistence across individuals and across time. The specific images differ, but the structure is often familiar. Being late, being chased, searching, failing, returning home and finding it transformed, speaking and not being heard, trying to protect something fragile. These are not random themes in the ordinary sense. They are patterns of concern. Their recurrence suggests that dream generation is deeply entangled with the systems that organize relevance in human life. It is not that the dream translates a single hidden wish into coded symbols with mechanical reliability. It is that the sleeping brain remains a concerned brain. It is still governed by what matters, though what matters may be reconfigured in the unusual conditions of the night. This was one reason the debate between Hobson and Solms never resolved into a simple victory for one side. Each had identified something real. Hobson emphasized that dream experience must be understood in relation to physiological state and internally generated activation. Solms emphasized that dreaming depends on forebrain and motivational systems, and therefore cannot be reduced to bottom-up activation alone. The enduring value of the dispute lies in how it forced dream science to become more precise. Dreaming could no longer be treated as a vague psychological leftover, nor could it be fully explained as the cortex's passive response to random brainstem firing. The field had to reckon with multiple levels of explanation at once. That that difficulty was not a sign of failure. It was a sign that the phenomenon itself was richer than the earlier models allowed. In a broader sense, this brought dream research closer to a modern understanding of the brain as predictive, selective, and value-laden. The brain does not merely register the world, it prioritizes, simulates, and organizes experience around needs and concerns. In waking life, external reality constrains that process. In dreams, those constraints are loosened, and the inner systems that assign salience may become more visible. The dream's bizarre settings may therefore coexist with remarkably consistent emotional structures, because the brain's world-building machinery is still being steered by what matters to the organism. This does not make dreams straightforward messages. It makes them dynamic constructions shaped by the meeting of state physiology, memory, imagination, and motivational force. Under that description, the dream begins to look less like an accident and more like a natural expression of how a sleeping brain remains organized around a self. That self, however, is not yet fully understood, and neither are the conditions under which it becomes dreamingly conscious. The lesion findings and theoretical shifts of this period opened the field but did not close it. If dreams can survive some kinds of REM disruption and disappear after some forebrain lesions, then the physiology of dreaming must be more distributed than earlier models assumed. If the dreamer inside the dream is structured by affect and motivation, then emotional systems require closer study. If dreams depend on scene construction, then the networks that support internally generated imagery also matter. The problem had become larger, but also more fertile. The science of dreaming was beginning to move from asking where the trigger lies to asking how a whole configuration of systems produces a temporary, inward, emotionally organized world, and that is where the next movement of the story begins to gather. Once the dream was recognized as more than a reflex of REM physiology, and once the sleeping self had re-entered the frame as an active participant shaped by memory, emotion, and motivational salience, another question emerged almost inevitably. If these systems are involved, then perhaps dreams are not only experiences that happen in sleep, perhaps they also participate in what sleep is doing. Perhaps the night mind is not just generating worlds, but reworking feeling, reactivating traces of memory, and reshaping what matters before morning arrives. And once the dreaming self had returned to the frame as something more than a passive witness to brainstem activation, the night began to look different again. The question was no longer only how dreams are triggered, or even which structures are required to generate them. It became harder to avoid a more intimate possibility. If dream experience draws so persistently from concern, memory, emotion, and motivational salience, then perhaps the dream is not simply an event that occurs during sleep. Perhaps it is one expression of work the sleeping brain is already doing. This shift did not happen all at once, and it did not produce a single new orthodoxy. Instead, it opened the field into several overlapping lines of inquiry, all circling the same deep suspicion that the night mind may be reorganizing more than it reveals. That suspicion grew stronger as researchers became less willing to equate dreaming exclusively with REM sleep. The older laboratory picture had been enormously productive, but over time it became clear that dream reports could also be obtained from non-REM awakenings, sometimes surprisingly often, depending on method, timing, and how one defined dream experience. What changed here was not merely a statistic, it was the conceptual center of the field. If people could report imagery, thoughts, scenes, or full dreamlike experiences from NREM sleep, then dreaming could no longer be treated as the simple psychological face of one single physiological stage. It had to be understood more broadly as a form of conscious experience, arising under multiple sleep conditions, though with different textures and probabilities in each. Recent reviews emphasize exactly this point, noting that compared with REM dreams, NNREM dreams are often shorter, less vivid, less bizarre, and more thought-like. But they are by no means absent. This raised a new kind of problem, one that moved the field closer to consciousness research itself. If dreaming is not identical to REM, then what matters most may not be the stage label, but the local neural conditions that allow an experience to arise in sleep at all. Francesca Ciclari's work became especially important here. Using high-density EEG and carefully timed awakenings, she and her colleagues showed that reports of dreaming, whether in REM or NREM, were associated with a decrease in low-frequency activity and a relative increase in faster activity within a posterior cortical region that came to be called the posterior hot zone. In later work focused specifically on NREM sleep, the group found that dreaming tended to occur when slow waves in central and posterior regions were sparse, small, and shallow. The implication was striking. Dreaming might depend less on belonging to a globally defined sleep stage than on whether certain cortical networks, especially posterior ones, had entered the right local state for conscious experience. What made this finding so important was not only that it localized something, it changed the logic of the question. Earlier research had asked, during which stage is dreaming most likely? Saklari's work asked, what kind of brain activity accompanies the presence or absence of any reportable experience in sleep? That is a subtler and more ambitious question. It treats dreaming not just as a special kind of imagery, but as a particular case of consciousness under sleeping conditions. In this framework, the issue is no longer merely whether the sleeper is in REM or NREM, but whether the networks supporting phenomenal experience are sufficiently active, integrated, or released from the slow oscillatory dominance that often suppresses reportable mentation. Dreaming becomes, in a sense, a window onto what it takes for experience itself to persist when the organism is asleep. Once the field began to think in those terms, another long-standing theme acquired new weight. Dreams had always seemed to borrow from memory. But now, memory was becoming a central biological topic in sleep research more broadly. Across the late 20th century and into the 21st, evidence accumulated that sleep supports memory consolidation, selective strengthening, replay, abstraction, and integration. This did not prove that dreams were the subjective face of memory processing, but it made the possibility increasingly attractive. If the sleeping brain is reactivating traces of recent learning, linking them to older networks, and reorganizing what it has taken in during the day, then dream imagery may be one visible edge of that deeper process. Some recent studies suggest exactly this kind of relationship, showing that pre-sleep experiences can shape later dream content, and that stronger neural reinstatement of recently encoded material can be associated with dreaming about that material. The appeal of this idea lies partly in how naturally it fits the texture of actual dreams. A dream rarely replays a day's events with documentary precision. Instead, fragments are displaced, fused, repeated, or relocated. A room from childhood receives the emotional weather of the present. A recent task returns in altered form. A familiar person appears under the pressure of an unrelated worry. This is exactly the sort of transformation one might expect if the sleeping brain were not merely storing memories like files, but reactivating and integrating them under conditions that privilege association over strict chronology. The dream, on this view, may not be a faithful replay of yesterday. It may be evidence that yesterday is being woven into a larger and older fabric. This possibility was strengthened by experiments showing that when subjects dreamed of a recently learned task, they sometimes performed better afterward, suggesting that dream content may at least index periods of active consolidation. Memory, however, is only half the story, because dream life is so often saturated not just with recollection, but with feeling. This is where Rosalind Cartwright's work became especially important. Cartwright approached dreams through the terrain of emotional life, including depression, divorce, ongoing distress, and recovery. She argued that dreaming may help regulate mood by bringing disturbing daytime concerns into contact with earlier memories and a broader sense of self, allowing emotional material to be integrated rather than simply repeated. In one widely cited formulation, dreams of those who eventually improved in mood seemed better able to carry ongoing waking concerns into sleep and embed them within a richer emotional context. Her work did not close the question, and not all later research has aligned neatly with it. But it gave dream science a compelling psychological possibility. The sleeping mind may not merely replay feeling, it may reshape it. This line of thought has remained attractive because it accords so well with common experience. Some dreams leave a person more unsettled in the morning, but others seem to have absorbed an emotional burden, not by solving it in words, but by working it through in images, scenes, and symbolic action. A grief that cannot yet be spoken may appear as a search. An unresolved argument may return in altered form until its emotional center shifts. A day of humiliation may not reappear directly, but its atmosphere may spread across a dream landscape. Contemporary research remains cautious here, and it should be evidence for dream-based emotion regulation is intriguing, but not uniform, and some theories in the field have likely been stated more strongly than the data warrant. Even so, recent work continues to find links between dream recall, dream effect, and next-day emotional reactivity, suggesting that at least in some contexts, dreaming may play an active role in emotional memory processing, rather than being a mere byproduct of it. As this emotional line of inquiry developed, another proposal offered a more explicitly evolutionary frame. Ravansuo's threat simulation theory argued that dreaming may function as a kind of virtual rehearsal space for threatening situations. According to this view, dream consciousness evolved in part to simulate danger, allowing the organism to practice detection, avoidance, and response under safe conditions. The theory gained traction because it fits something many people immediately recognize. Dreams are full of pursuit, loss, injury, social danger, and scenarios in which the self is forced into urgent action. Ravansuo and collaborators supported the idea with content analysis work, suggesting that threats occur frequently in dreams, and that the dream self is often directly involved in them. Under this interpretation, the night mind is not merely wandering, it is training, and yet the fate of threat simulation illustrates something very characteristic of dream science. The theory was vivid, plausible, and generative, but the empirical record proved mixed. Some studies supported the frequency and realism of threatening events in dreams, while others argued that dream threats are often unrealistic, poorly resolved, or insufficiently adaptive to support a clear rehearsal function. Critics also noted that many dreams are not organized around threat at all, and that even threatening dreams do not always show effective defensive action. The result was not the collapse of the theory so much as its moderation. Threat simulation remains an important lens, especially for explaining certain recurrent classes of dream content, but it has not become the single accepted function of dreaming. Instead, it now sits among a family of partial explanations, each capturing something real about the night mind without exhausting it. A parallel and in some ways gentler alternative came from William Domhoff and other neurocognitive approaches, which treated dreaming less as a special-purpose evolutionary simulator and more as a continuation of the brain's ordinary capacity for internally generated thought. In this view, dreams belong on a spectrum with mind wandering, imagination, daydreaming, spontaneous memory, and self-generated simulation. What changes in sleep is not that the mind becomes something entirely new, but that external input fades, executive control weakens, and internally generated imagery gains freer rein. This perspective has a certain quiet power because it lowers the temperature of the old debates. The dream need not be either a coded confession or meaningless noise. It may simply be one form of the brain's enduring talent for constructing worlds when released from the discipline of waking perception. That talent, under sleeping conditions, becomes more immersive, more emotional, and more bizarre, but it remains recognizably continuous with waking mentation. The advantage of this broader neurocognitive framing is that it can accommodate much of what the field had learned without forcing everything into one formula. Dreams can draw on memory because memory reactivation is part of sleep. They can carry strong emotional charge because salience and affective systems remain active. They can be shaped by current concerns because those concerns organize waking mentation as well. They can include threats because the brain is deeply sensitive to danger and social evaluation. They can occur in both REM and NREM because the core requirement may be the right configuration for conscious experience and internal simulation. Not one single stage label. From this perspective, the night mind does not perform one task only. It remains a flexible generative system whose products reveal multiple overlapping processes at once. What is striking, looking across these lines of work, is how the center of gravity has shifted. The old question was whether dreams meant anything. The later question was whether they could be explained by REM physiology and activation. Now, the deeper issue concerns the form of conscious experience that sleep allows, and the functions or side effects that may accompany it. Are dreams part of how emotional memories are reworked? Are they markers of memory reactivation? Are they virtual simulations of concern, social danger, and unfinished tasks? Or are they the natural overflow overflow of a brain that never stops generating internal models? Most likely, the answer depends on the level of explanation one chooses. A dream can be at once a locally generated conscious experience, a memory-shaped construction, an emotionally weighted simulation, and an index of ongoing nighttime processing. Dream science has become more sophisticated precisely by giving up the hope that one sentence could contain the whole phenomenon. By this stage in the story, then, the night no longer looks like a passive interval, broken only by occasional bursts of private fantasy. It looks like an active, cognitive, and emotional environment, one in which the sleeping brain continues to sort, select, reactivate, integrate, and stage experience in multiple forms. Some of those forms are brief and thought-like. Some are immersive and vividly scenic. Some seem tied to yesterday. Others carry concerns much older than the day just lived. The most careful researchers remain cautious because the methods are still difficult and the interpretations still contested. But the field has nevertheless moved far from its beginnings. Dreaming is now studied not as an ornamental side effect of sleep, but as one of the clearest signs that the mind remains busy in the dark. And this is perhaps the most delicate point of all. The more we learn about dreams, the less they appear to belong to a single explanatory register. They are subjective, yet tied to measurable brain states. They are shaped by memory, yet not reducible to replay. They are emotionally charged, yet not always therapeutic. They may rehearse threat, yet not always adaptively. They look discontinuous with waking thought, yet they often reveal the same mind continuing under altered conditions. The sleeping brain has not surrendered its capacity to build a world. It has only changed the materials and rules by which that world is made. The final step, then, is not to force a final answer, but to ask what remains at the edges of our understanding, where dreaming meets lucid awareness, where REM mechanisms fail or intrude, and where the mystery, even after all this work, still refuses to disappear. And it is there, at the edge of those lingering uncertainties, that the final part of the story becomes most revealing. The closer dream science moved toward mechanism, the more it discovered that its clearest insights often came from exceptions, unstable border states, and failures in the system, rather than from tidy theory alone. A dream recalled from ordinary sleep could still be debated. A correlation between REM and vivid dreaming could still be refined or challenged. But when the normal structure of sleep partially broke open, when awareness appeared inside a dream, when muscle atonia failed, or when REM physiology intruded into waking consciousness, the brain exposed something of its hidden design. These unusual states did not solve the mystery, they sharpened it. They showed that dreaming is not a sealed compartment of the night, but part of a broader continuum in which consciousness, embodiment, and sleep regulation continually negotiate with one another. One of the most compelling examples is lucid dreaming, a condition in which the dreamer becomes aware, while still asleep, that the ongoing experience is a dream. For centuries, lucid dreams occupied an uncertain place between anecdote, contemplative practice, and private fascination. They sounded too rare and too unstable to function as a central scientific object. Yet modern neuroscience has treated them with increasing seriousness, precisely because they disturb the ordinary rules of dream consciousness. In a typical dream, the dreamer accepts the dream world as given, however impossible it may be. In a lucid dream, that acceptance is interrupted from within, a reflective layer appears. The dreamer may recognize the state, remember waking intentions, or even exert some degree of control over the dream environment, though such control is far from guaranteed. A 2024 Neuron review describes lucid dreaming as a vivid dream state marked by conscious awareness of the ongoing oniric condition, while emphasizing how rare, fragile, and experimentally difficult it remains. What makes lucid dreaming so valuable is not simply its strangeness, but the way it blurs categories that earlier sections of this documentary tried to keep distinct. In lucid dreaming, REM sleep and self-reflective awareness coexist in an unusual combination. The dreamer remains in the internally generated world of sleep, yet some elements of waking-style metacognition re-emerge. This has allowed researchers to ask unusually direct questions about consciousness in dreams, especially when trained lucid dreamers signal from within the dream by making agreed eye movements that can be detected on polysomnographic recordings. The result is a rare bridge between subjective report and objective timing. Instead of inferring dream experience only after awakening, scientists can sometimes identify in real time that a dreamer has become aware inside the dream. The same neuron review stresses that advances in wearable devices, larger collaborative samples, and AI-assisted analysis may improve this research. But it also makes clear that lucid dreaming remains unstable and difficult to summon reliably. That instability is itself instructive. Lucid dreaming suggests that the dreaming brain is not fixed in one immutable form, but capable of partial reconfiguration. Reflective awareness, which usually fades in ordinary dreaming, can return under some conditions without fully dissolving the dream state. This implies that the sleeping mind is not governed by a single switch between unconsciousness and waking-style consciousness. Rather, different components of awareness may reappear unevenly, producing hybrid states. The significance of this reaches beyond the practice of lucid dream induction. It suggests that dreaming is one of the clearest natural laboratories for studying how experience can remain vivid while self-monitoring varies in degree. Dreaming, in other words, is not merely something the brain has, it is one of the ways the brain reveals the layered architecture of consciousness itself. If lucid dreaming shows how reflective awareness can intrude into REM without breaking it apart entirely, REM sleep behavior disorder shows what happens when the opposite barrier fails. Here, the problem is not that waking-style self-awareness enters the dream, but that the body begins to escape the usual paralysis of REM sleep. The dreamer may shout, strike, leap, or enact defensive movements corresponding to dream content, sometimes injuring themselves or a bed partner in the process. This disorder is clinically important in its own right, but it has also become one of the most revealing windows into the neurobiology of dreaming, because it demonstrates with unsettling clarity that rematonia is not a minor accompaniment to dream sleep. It is one of its essential safeguards. Reviews from 2024 and 2025 continue to describe REM sleep behavior disorder as a parasomnia strongly associated with later alpha-synuclein neurodegeneration, including Parkinson's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, and multiple system atrophy. The scientific importance of that association is difficult to overstate. What once looked like a bizarre sleep disturbance has become, in many cases, an early neurological warning sign. A 2024 review on REM sleep behavior disorder and alpha-synuclein describes long-term phenoconversion rates to Parkinsonism or dementia that are remarkably high, and it notes clinico-pathologic evidence strongly linking isolated REM sleep behavior disorder to underlying synucleinopathy. This means that a dream acted out in the night may sometimes be one of the earliest observable signs of a slowly evolving neurodegenerative process. The dream, then, is no longer only a subject for psychology or consciousness studies. It becomes part of neurology, biomarker development, and prodromal diagnosis. Here, the sleeping brain teaches by malfunction. When the barrier between dreamed action and bodily action weakens, the disorder reveals both how the normal system is built and how closely that system may be tied to deeper disease processes. This is one of the most moving and sobering ways dream science has matured. The field began with private experience, with recalled images, with meaning and interpretation, then moved through EEG traces, REM discoveries, and theoretical battles over activation, forebrain involvement, memory, and emotion. Now, in disorders like REM sleep behavior disorder, it confronts the fact that the sleeping brain can disclose illness before daytime cognition clearly does. To act out a dream is not merely to have intense sleep. It may be to stand at a biological threshold between ordinary dream physiology and the future onset of neurodegenerative disease. The same mechanisms that once made REM look paradoxical now become clinically actionable. A state discovered through curiosity becomes a site of medical vigilance. That is one of science's quietest patterns. Wonder and diagnosis often meet in the same place. A related but psychologically distinct border phenomenon is sleep paralysis, which has long occupied a curious space between clinical medicine and folklore. Unlike REM sleep behavior disorder, where dream motor inhibition fails, sleep paralysis is often understood as a state in which REM atonia persists or intrudes while awareness has already returned. The person feels awake, or nearly awake, but cannot move or speak. Episodes are frequently accompanied by vivid hallucinations, often involving an intruder, chest pressure, or a sensed presence in the room. A 2024 review describes sleep paralysis as occurring during the transitions into or out of sleep, when an individual becomes conscious, while REM, like muscle atonia, still persists, often with intense fear and hallucinatory experiences. The condition is thus not merely frightening by accident, it is frightening because it combines waking-style awareness with a body still under REM's motor rules and a mind still partly open to dreamlike imagery. This physiological framing helps explain why sleep paralysis has generated such a rich folklore across cultures. Long before sleep medicine had a name for it, people interpreted the experience through whatever cosmology made sense to them. A 2015 review on sleep paralysis and folklore notes that for centuries many understood such attacks as visitations by malevolent beings, incubus figures, or nocturnal demons. The experience is ideally structured for supernatural interpretation. The sufferer is conscious, immobilized, terrified, and often confronted with a hallucinated presence that feels astonishingly real. In this case, modern neuroscience does not merely replace myth with mechanism. It reveals why myth had such persuasive power in the first place. A physiology of REM intrusion can produce precisely the sort of experience that cultures, lacking a biological frame, would naturally populate with entities, curses, spirits, or oppressive nighttime visitors. Together, lucid dreaming, REM sleep behavior disorder, and sleep paralysis show that dreaming is not best understood as a single sealed state, but as part of a delicate architecture with multiple movable boundaries. Awareness can partially return without fully ending the dream. Motor inhibition can fail while dreaming continues. Waking consciousness can reappear before REM atonia has fully lifted. These examples matter because they expose the structure of ordinary dream sleep by violating it. They show that the dream state depends on a balance among internally generated imagery, bodily restraint, sensory disconnection, and varying levels of reflective awareness. Disturb one element, and the experience changes in characteristic ways. This is how edge cases often teach. They make the hidden engineering of the normal condition briefly visible, and yet even with these insights, dream science remains methodologically difficult in ways that no elegant theory has entirely overcome. Dreams are private, fleeting, and often distorted by recall. Even the gold standard of awakening sleepers during the night captures experience only after a delay, and recent methodological work emphasizes how much dream recall depends on awakening itself, on timing, and on the sensor-like role of the waking report. A 2025 review devoted to this issue argues that awakenings are central to dream reporting, and that the apparent frequency or content of dreaming can shift depending on when and how subjects are sampled. This is a reminder that even when the physiology is carefully tracked, the scientific object remains partly elusive. The dream we study is never the dream in its pure original form. It is always a dream as remembered, recovered, or lost at the threshold of waking. That limitation is not a trivial technical problem. It affects how strongly any theory can be stated. For decades, researchers argued about whether dreaming belonged chiefly to REM, whether it reflected brainstem activation, forebrain motivation, memory reprocessing, emotional regulation, threat simulation, or internally generated mind wandering under altered conditions. What the field has gradually learned is that different levels of explanation may all capture part of the truth. Dreaming is a form of conscious experience. It is constrained by sleep physiology. It draws from memory and affect. It can be modified by local cortical conditions. It may index, accompany, or participate in broader processing during sleep. Contemporary reviews of consciousness and sleep reflect precisely this complexity, noting that dreaming reveals a remarkably lively sleeping brain, one that recombines intrinsic activation patterns freed from ongoing behavior and from full cognitive control. This means the final answer to our original question must remain more layered than neat. What happens in the brain when we dream is not one thing only. The brain shifts into states in which external input recedes, and internal generation becomes dominant. Certain systems support vivid imagery and scene construction. Others modulate emotional salience, memory reactivation, or the feeling of being a self inside an unfolding world. In REM sleep, muscle atonia usually protects the body from acting out dream life, while the dream itself may remain immersive and intense. In lucid dreaming, reflective awareness can partly return. In sleep paralysis, our REM physiology can intrude into waking. In REM sleep behavior disorder, the body can escape the paralysis meant to restrain it. The boundaries are real, but they are not absolute. If there is a broader lesson here, it is that dreams have repeatedly forced science to become more humble about the mind. At first, the dream looked like a message. Then it looked like a byproduct of activation. Then it looked like a state-dependent form of subjectivity shaped by memory, emotion, and local brain dynamics. Each step brought genuine insight, but none fully dissolved the phenomenon. The more carefully the sleeping brain has been studied, the less it resembles a machine doing one simple task in the dark. It resembles a dynamic, multi-layered system in which consciousness can persist in altered form. The body can be selectively disconnected, memories can be recombined, fears can be simulated, and awareness can sometimes look back at itself from within the dream. That is not a failure of explanation. It is a sign that the object being explained is genuinely rich. By morning, then, the mystery has not disappeared. It has changed shape. We understand far more than earlier generations could have imagined. We know that sleep has structure, that REM is paradoxical, that dreaming is not confined entirely to REM, that local cortical states matter, that memory and emotion enter deeply into dream life, and that disorders at the borders of REM can expose the machinery of ordinary dream sleep. But what we do not possess is a single sentence that closes the subject forever. Dreams remain one of the rare places where neuroscience, psychology, intellectual history, folklore, and clinical medicine still meet in the same dark room. And perhaps that is fitting. The brain, even in sleep, does not cease to create a world. It only creates one under conditions that reveal how much of any world was always being made from within. By the end of this journey, the dreaming brain appears both more intimate and more mysterious than it did at the beginning. We now know that dreaming is not the idle residue of a mind that has switched off. It emerges from living systems of memory, emotion, bodily regulation, and shifting neural activity. The sleeping brain does not retreat into emptiness. It continues to generate experience, sometimes vivid, sometimes fragmented, sometimes deeply emotional, and sometimes so strange that it seems to belong to another world entirely. That realization has changed more than our understanding of sleep. It has changed the way we think about consciousness itself. Dreams remind us that the mind is not confined to the clear, orderly awareness of waking life. Even in darkness, even in stillness, the brain continues to build models, weave scenes, revive old feelings, and test fragments of reality against the inner logic of the self. In trying to understand dreams, scientists were forced to confront a humbling truth. The boundary between reason and imagination, between biology and experience, is far more subtle than it first appears. And perhaps that is part of what makes this subject endure. Science advances not only by finding answers, but by learning how much depth lies inside an ordinary fact of life. Every night, countless people drift into sleep and enter experiences they will only partly remember, if at all. Yet hidden within that familiar passage is one of the most delicate frontiers in the study of the human mind. If you have listened this far, perhaps you have felt that strange closeness for yourself, the sense that the most private things can also become part of a shared search for understanding. And somewhere, in laboratories, clinics, and quiet rooms where sleep is still being watched, that search continues.